last week, we learned about Abram coming out of Egypt, and we're also hearing about Israel coming out of Egypt. So if you would, take your Bibles and turn to Genesis chapter 13. Genesis 13 as we carry on going through and studying through the book of Genesis. I hope you all are enjoying our study through the book of Genesis and the opportunity to go through this. I know this is my first time to go all the way through and share all of it since I've been teaching. So I'm excited to go through this and to really dig into this book. Obviously, it's foundational to our faith, being the first one and the primary setting up of the history and understanding of God's people. But last week we talked about Abram, and Sarai in that instance, going from the promised land that was is to be given to them to Egypt because there was a famine in the land. And so they thought, let's get out of here. We're out of food. We need to go down to where there's food. There's food around the Nile River. We're going to go down there. But in the process of that, the question becomes, and we aren't really told one way or another, so I'm not going to say that we're told this one way or another, but there is somewhat of a unique understanding as you read Genesis 12 and 13 that maybe this wasn't what Yehovah wanted for Abram. This is what Abram wanted for Abram. And so, of course, when he went down there he's thinking, well, we'll be okay there. We'll have food and everything's good. When he gets down there, problems happen. So we see that a lack of faith on the part of Abram causes a serious thing to happen between him and his wife and Pharaoh down there, who takes Sarai to be his wife. Remember, because Abram lied to Pharaoh and everybody there because he said it was this, hey, let them know that you're my sister. We're not married in here in case they want to kill me. You're my sister, so say that and we'll be all good. Obviously, that wasn't what God wanted, and God protected Sarai and the plan that he had for Abram. And not only that, but through this whole circumstance, he has Pharaoh blessing Abram and giving them things so that when he comes out of the land of Egypt, he is more wealthy than when he went in. Because, sometimes, even when we do wrong, Yah works everything out. Well, I shouldn't say sometimes. All the time, God, whenever we do things that are wrong, Yehovah works out those things for our good, doesn't he? And sometimes that good is teaching us lessons. Sometimes that good actually comes in the form of physical good. In this instance, Abram got both. And so in Genesis chapter 13, we see the story of him returning to the land. And some different in this one section here, the different things are going to happen to him, and that are going to teach and continue to train the father of many nations. I think that Genesis chapter 13 is actually a turning point in the life of Abram. Not his last one, or not his final test or training, but a significant part of his training. And so he goes back from Egypt to where he had come from. He goes back to, we are told, to some towns or some places in the land called near Bethel and Ai. Back to the place where he had built an altar. Back to the place where it says in Genesis 12 that he had first called on the name of Yehovah. And that is where our message is going to begin today. And what we'll see is this: a life, and the idea, and looking at Abram and his story, we'll see a life that walks with Yehovah is not marked with perfection. It is marked by returning when things don't happen the way that, or we don't do things the way God wants, to return to him. How sometimes that we have a call to separate from evil around us and things that aren't right around us. That in our lives we need to trust in him no matter what. And that also when we have a relationship with our Father, we desire to worship him. And so we start out here in verses 1 through 4. Then Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him, to the south. Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold, and he went on his journey from the south as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar which he had made there at first. And there Abram called on the name of Yehovah. He called on his name. I think it's interesting, my wife bringing out that the children of Israel didn't necessarily know who his name was, and neither did obviously Pharaoh and the people there. And so a great deal of the understanding of the plagues is that his name is going to go forward. And here in this passage in chapter 13, we see that is a primary aspect of what is mentioned here about Abram, that he is calling on the name of Yehovah. There's that relationship there between him and the Father and the Creator of the universe. Now, I want to point something out here in the way that this is translated a little bit. It says something that you might find a little interesting. It says that he went from Egypt, he went up from Egypt to the south. He went up from Egypt to the south. Now, do you understand that? That sounds like a good, Southerners like to say that, I'm going up everywhere you go. It doesn't matter what direction cardinally you're going in, you're always going up, right? I've always had a problem with that, and when I hear people say that, I'm like, no, you can't go up from Michigan down to Florida. You're going down to Florida, okay? And I try to correct people on that. It's just my geographic brain, I guess. But in here, this is actually a legitimate thing that's being spoken of. The term, the south there in Hebrew is Negev, okay? And Negev in Hebrew means south. So what he is saying is he's going up from Egypt back up to the southern part of Israel. Even today, if you go over there, they call that region of Israel the Negev, or the south. All right? So it'd be like, you were saying, if we said, I'm going from Texas to Florida, I'm flying, you might say if you were in Hebrew, I'm flying Negev, I'm flying south to go down there. So here in this journey, he is going up from Egypt to the Negev, or to the south of Israel, back to where he came from. And so he's going back into Canaan. And that's where he's going to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, to the place of the altar. And there Abram had called on the name of Yehovah. And so we see Abram retracing his steps, not because it was familiar or the easiest path, but because it was the path that brought spiritual relationship and connection once again. Spiritual relationship and connection. So when he had left the land, he left out of what God had called him to do, hadn't he? He had been called from where he had grown up into this land and said, this is going to be what I'm going to give you. But in the process of last week, he moves down south and goes away from that, looking for help, not from God, or from man. And now God is calling him back, and he realizes, I need to get back into that relationship. And so he returns to Bethel, and he returns to Ai. And it's really interesting as you look at those two words in the Hebrew and what they mean. Bethel, pretty easy if you understand. El is a term for God, a shortened term for God. Beth or Bet is house, so Bethel means house of God. All right, that's a place where God was dwelling. The second term there, Ai, means heap or ruin. Heap or ruin. And so the believer's life is always lived between Bethel and Ai. It's always between the house of God and heap or ruin. Between the closeness with Yehovah and failure. or as I like to put it, between resting and testing. All right? Resting in the house of God, testing from the heap and the ruins of this world. And so Abram is returning to between these two locations at the place where he had built an altar at the first. It's interesting because as I was thinking about that, it might have been someone here, I'm not sure, I can't remember who it was, but someone was telling me a story one time about a time that they went to, where they were going to church and to a service, and it really had an impact on them. And this individual was talking to me about their pastor at that time had come, and they had come through the service, they did all the singing and everything, and the pastor got up, and he asked the people, remember the time when you first became a believer? Do you remember where you were? Do you remember what it was like and when that was? And he's told the people, he said, okay, think about that and kind of write it down on a piece of paper. So they had everybody real quick writing it down on a piece of paper. And in that individual, he said at the end of that time, the pastor got up and said, and didn't do anything else. He said, now I want you to take, and this week, instead of having services today, I want you to go back, if you can, to where it is that you started from, and remember where you became a believer. And as I was reading through this, I was like, that's interesting, that connects there. That's exactly what, in essence, Abraham was doing, is he was going back to the beginning where things started from. He was going back to where the connection with Yehovah started. And so we see the concept of restoration happening. Restoration does not require a new path, a new direction. It requires oftentimes returning to the original one, the original place that we started. We see here there's no new method of restoration. Abram does not invent a new thing. He returns to where Yehovah first met him. He comes back to the same God he left, the same altar he built, and the same calling that God had given him in the first place. When I think about our name here, some of you are new, some of you have been here quite a while. Some of you may know the concept of our name, Solel. Others don't. If you want to, you can go on the website and click under About Us, and it has a little bit more definition. But there's a plan and a purpose and everything, and the name definitely has a purpose. Obviously, it's a Hebrew name. It's not an English name. I understand that. Sometimes that throws people off. Like, why do you have a Hebrew name? But it's always been my desire since we started here to have a connection, a place there both Jew and Gentile comes together to worship God. And that together, as the scripture talks, all the dividing wall is gone, and the two become one, and we are here worshiping God together at Solel on the Shabbat, fellowshipping together as one body. And so we see the concept of Solel is the idea of a pathfinder. Okay, it's the idea that of an explorer, in essence. But it's more than that. It's someone who, it's not just an explorer, but it's someone who is trying to make a way for others to come after them. And so we chose Solel among all the possibilities of names for this congregation because our desire was to go through and clear the path back to God and back to the Torah, back to Jerusalem and the land, that others may follow us, that we can be along the side pulling others on to the path. And so some people are like, why did you pick that name? I mean, there are all these wonderful names that are out there that we could have picked, but I think it has, and you understand the symbolism there, it has a very profound meaning to what we want to do here at Solel. And the fact that I didn't want all of it to be in Hebrew. I didn't want all of it to be in English. I wanted a mix there so that people could go and question, okay, what does this mean? And give us the opportunity to share what our desire and what our vision and purpose here is at Solel. And so we see that the path that we are finding and seeking isn't a new one. The path that we are looking for here is not a new one. But throughout the millennia, it's been overgrown. It's been filled up so that it is not as clear as it once was. And so we are seeking as we get onto the road to clear it off and to bring others onto it. When we think back to history where the verses that I got this from come from in the book of Isaiah, remember that the children of Israel, many of them had been taken off into exile, almost all of them. And as they left, the land was left with no one in it. And things began to get overgrown. How many of you have ever seen a former trail or something that's been left alone for some time and all the vegetation grows over it? Anybody ever seen that? I'm amazed at how fast that happens. I really, not being a city slicker for most of my life and moving into the country as an adult, it's been intriguing things like that to see and go, wow, I would have thought it would take a long time. But it's amazing how fast that growth can overcome things. And so the idea of what Isaiah was telling the people to do when the word Solel, that type of word is in here, is when they went back to the land, that 10% that God says is going to go back from the exile in 70 years, their job was to go and begin to clear the path once again back to Jerusalem, back into the land. All those pathways that have been overgrown, they were clearing them, that others may slowly trickle back and follow the original vanguard, those initial pathfinders back into the land. And in so doing, it has a symbolic as well as a literal understanding. Because not only were they coming back to the physical land, not only were they coming back to Jerusalem, but they were actually coming back to God, to Yehovah. And they were going to come back to the Torah. And they were going to start living it again. Because remember, in the land, or in the dispersion in Babylon, they weren't able to do these things. Much of what they were supposed to do in the Torah, they couldn't do because they were not in the land. They did not have the temple and the priesthood. They were unclean. And so many of these things had to be developed and redone that others may come along and be able to worship once again as they were supposed to in the land. So I see here with Abram returning to this place to call again this total concept of this restoration, just like the idea that's in Isaiah of the whole children of Israel. He's calling on the name of Yehovah. And as he does this, he's implying once again a renewed dependence, a renewed confession, a renewed worship that he had lost in going down to Egypt. One commentary states that the individual, T.H. Leal, says that he observes that memory itself becomes a means of grace in this situation. That looking back at where Yehovah met us strengthens our present faith. So in looking back at where Abram had come from with God, he was actually growing his future faith. It is almost as if Abram is challenged to remember where he had come from. When a man drifts from Elohim, he does not need a new experience. He needs a return. Go back to the Word, to the place of prayer, to the habits of obedience. The place where you were strongest spiritually is often where you first met your God. Jeremiah chapter 6 and verse 16 says it this way. Thus says Yehovah, stand in the ways and see and ask for the old paths where the good way is and walk in it. Then you will find rest for your souls. Jeremiah 6 verse 16. A lot of times, especially in our day and age, we like to find new and shiny things, don't we? Our culture has become a new and shiny type of a culture. And so when things aren't working right, we always want to find something new to go to because that's going to fix everything. Anybody disagree with me on that? But when you think about that, often believers think that the same way with their spiritual life. And we oftentimes are looking for fixing and correcting ourselves for the next spiritual experience. But every seasoned believer eventually understands this. Spiritual growth happens from remembering the beginning. Your strength and maturity comes from staying close to the altar of God. And so Abraham's back in the land. He's settled down. He's come back and renewed his relationship with Yehovah. Let's look at verses 5 through 13. Lot also, who went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents. Now the land was not able to support them, that they might dwell together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. So God is truly blessing them through even their own foolish mistakes at this point in time. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. The Canaanites and the Perizzites then dwelt in the land. So Abram said to Lot, please, let there be no strife between you and me, and between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brethren. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If you take the left, then I will go to the right, or if you go to the right, then I will go to the left. And Lot lifted his eyes and saw all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere, before Yehovah destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of Yehovah, like the land of Egypt as you go toward Zoar. Then Lot chose for himself all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east. And they separated from each other. Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain and pitched his tent, even as far as Sodom. But the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against Yehovah. And so we see here this story between these two individuals, Abram and his nephew Lot, and they've come so great together that they cannot live in the same place, and so they're like, let's separate. After great animosity, of course, Abram comes and peacefully says that to Lot, and says, let's move. And he gives Lot, the younger, the opportunity to choose where he's going to go. And so we see that Lot looks out. He looks and uses his sight. It says, Lot lifted his eyes and saw, and what did he see? The plain of Jordan out there. And it says that the plain of Jordan looked like the garden of Yehovah. It looked like Egypt, where he had just come from. So it was well watered, and it was beautiful. It was lush. Recently, I've seen a lot of pictures of the land of Israel just in the last couple months that I had never seen before. I don't know if I forgive me if I shared this in the last couple weeks, but I saw like beautiful fields and wildflowers everywhere, and green, and trees, and snow. And everybody's like, snow? But if you think about what you typically think about with the land of Israel, you don't usually think of snow, do you? Snow on some of the mountains up in the north. And birds and all sorts of wildlife, foxes, and of course goats and sheep and cattle all over the place. And I was like, wow, this is the land of Israel? This is not the land of Israel I've ever seen before in my life. And I was quite impressed. And I could see where now seeing these pictures, what Lot was looking at and going like, yeah, my sheep are going to get nice and fat and have great wool, and I'm going to become even richer, and we're going to live the high life down on the lowlands there by the Jordan River, and everything's going to be beautiful. So Lot chooses what appears best. But if we contrast what is being spoken of here, we see that Abram chooses by faith. He doesn't go and go, wait a minute, Lot. No, you can't have that land. Or you can have half of it, but the other half's mine. You know, he doesn't go like that. He just goes, okay. Lot, you got that? You chose that? Okay, I'll choose this. I'll take the mountains. I'll take the crags. I'll take the dry land that isn't as good for feeding my flocks on. Why? Because I'm going to trust in Yehovah to provide. Another commentator writes on this section, he says, there is nothing lost by meekness. Lot is crossed in what he chose. Abraham is blessed in what was left. We see that in this passage here and in this story that there is a hidden danger in using sight to make choices. I think of that as very prevalent even up to today. It did, all the way back in Genesis chapter 13, the psyche of humanity has been known. Unfortunately, it took several thousand years, and then we figured it out, like with all these science and testing and psychology, and they made a new thing called marketing, and said, we figured out man. They only had to look back at the Bible, and they could have figured out man. But modern marketing lives off of this understanding that pretty things are what many people look at. Sight is something that we all use as our way to decide whether things are good or bad. And unfortunately, that concept has destroyed many a life. Lot saw the fertility of the plains and pitches his tent towards Sodom. Notice he's not in Sodom yet. He's just toward Sodom. We see that in that direction matters also. Compromise begins with small decisions, small choices. He didn't go all the way to Sodom in the first go, did he? He went part of the way. And then a little bit later, he probably moves a little bit closer. And then he's like, boy, that as he gets closer to the city, he sees it looks prettier and prettier, and it draws him closer and closer. I am really intrigued in our modern culture by this concept of gambling. Has anybody noticed it? How much gambling is expanded in the last, say, 15 years? It feels like, between that and marijuana, it's like every other commercial, or every billboard as you go down the road is about one of those two things. And it's amazing to me how much we spend. Oh, by the way, you're spending a lot of your tax dollars telling people not to gamble. Just in case you didn't know that. Which I always think is interesting, too. Because on one hand, we love gambling. I remember growing up, when they first decided they were going to do lottery system in the States, state lotteries. Probably, I think almost every one of us, if you're over the age of, like, say, 40, would remember this. But I remember that, and there was all these great promises, right? We're going to save everything. We're going to fix everything with lottery. Anybody remember that? All the campaigning that went on to get it to be passed? I wonder if they did a true study at how many lives have been destroyed, what they would find versus how many have been fixed by the money that they have garnered by the state. It was in my economics class in college that I realized that the lottery is a poor tax. How many rich people go and buy lottery tickets? Because they're all rich. Why do they need a lottery ticket? Lottery tickets are poor tax. They're for people that, if I can only get rich, this is what will happen. I will be fine and successful. And so they go and spend what little money they have trying to get that dream of that riches. It's no different than what Lot was doing. Just a different scenario. And so they go and they spend all this money trying to do this and they get little bits, just enough to keep them coming back. And then every once in a while, though, someone strikes it rich. And I forget the statistics. It's been a long time since I've heard these, but 10, 15 years ago, they were talking about those that have won big lottery winnings, millions and millions of dollars, and they say within like 5 years, they're back to being as poor as where they were when they started, is the average. Something along that lines. Because those things are fleeting. They're the world trying to appease man's sense of a need of God. And in so doing, they pull us away from the one true God, just like they pulled Lot away from the one true God and his center with Abram, his relationship with God through Abram. And instead, he's going towards the world and the pole of Sodom and Gomorrah. So Abram, in juxtaposition to Lot, chooses by faith. He does not grasp, he does not argue, he trusts Yehovah to provide. There's a hidden danger in using sight to make choices. We see that with Lot here. He saw all that fertility out there and went after it. When we think about those things, not every good-looking opportunity is from Yehovah. We must walk by faith and biblical wisdom in making decisions in our lives. A man once said, if I don't take this opportunity, I might lose everything. Abraham would answer that man, if Yehovah gave it, you cannot lose it. If you must grasp it, it was never yours to begin with. And so we see this juxtaposition between Lot and Abram, in this passage. Moving on, Genesis chapter 13, verses 14 through 17. And Yehovah said to Abram, and after Lot had separated from him, lift your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. For all the land which you see I give to you and your descendants forever. And I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if a man could number the dust of the earth, then your descendants also could be numbered. Arise, walk in the land through its length and its width, for I give it to you. So after Lot had separated from, Yehovah speaks to Abraham again. There are moments sometimes when clarity comes from our ability to be still, to wait upon Yehovah. I think we see an interesting parallel in this chapter. When Lot lifted up his eyes, it says that he chose his desires. However, here Abram is told to lift his eyes so that he may receive the promise that Yehovah is going to give him. You see, Lot chooses to lift up his eyes and see. The other, Yehovah, lifts up Abram's eyes to see. And as he does that, he tells him, look all around, and all this will be yours. Not just the stuff that Abraham had said, I will take once you choose yours, Lot. I will choose the hills and up here on the rocky crags. But God says, not only are you going to get that, but you're going to get everything that Lot took too. That will also be yours. He will not be able to separate that from you. And so we see as Yehovah shares in this instance with Abram, there's promises here that are unconditional and expansive. Number one, we see a promise of land. All the land which you see I give to you and your descendants forever. And then we see legacy. I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth. In these two promises, we see the powerful, everlasting plans that Yehovah is making with Abram that still exists today. If we look around in our world today, we look at the land of Israel. And I think it's amazing. This little plot of land that's smaller than the size of New Jersey, is literally like the center of the earth. You ever thought about that? Look at a globe. Where's the center of the earth? It really is there. I never thought about that until I was an adult. And yet you go back and you begin to look historically at what's going on. And historically, as I shared a little bit of this last week, almost all these battles that happened in the Middle East between all these empires, they were constantly fighting over that piece of property because it was the gateway to everywhere else. If you needed to get from Egypt to Mesopotamia, you had to go through Israel. If you were going to get from the Hittites in Turkey down to Egypt, you had to go through Israel. If you were going to go from Babylon to Egypt, you had to go through Israel. Everybody had to go through Israel. And so it became one of the most fought after pieces of property in the entire world. And it still is to this day. And so we see a fight that's continually going on. And I think it's so amazing that a people that were scattered throughout the world have come back together on that same plot of land. Those that used to live in that land but were scattered by God, and I believe it was scattered by God, they did wrong and they were scattered, have been brought back to that place because it's God's timing. If you ever have the time to read, there's a good book series by a person whose name is hard to say versus how it's spelled, but Bodhi Taney is T-H-O-E-N-E, I think is how it's spelled, if I remember correctly. But she goes through and does a historical narrative of 1948 and the independence of Israel. I highly recommend this series. It's very good, very accurate, very historical. And it gets you to understand, to me, how Yehovah worked mightily in miracle form to bring the country of modern-day Israel back into existence. No, I'm not here to say that modern-day Israel is God's chosen people and they're perfect and they're living the Torah and all this stuff. I don't agree with that. The most gay city in the world is Tel Aviv. It's full of sin. But I do think that God has worked mightily to go to where the direction we see with Israel today. And I do think that when people bless Israel, as the command says, they will be blessed. And when they curse Israel, they will be cursed. And I do not think, as so many are today, that the Jewish people are done away with. I think it's a very terrible thing, and I'm sharing it today because I hope not only you guys, but many others will hear this. There is a growing movement among the Torah community that believes that the Jews are not the Jews, and that Israel is no longer the land. And I think that is a terrible thing. It's a tragedy that is coming, and the world is spilling at once, just like every other time with history, coming over into the Torah community. It's spilled over into the original first century Torah community. Why do we think that just as we're living today that it isn't going to have that happen today? And if we aren't careful, we'll become just like history all over again. Thinking that the Jews aren't worthwhile. The Jews aren't necessary. The land of Israel is not God's land. It's done away with. It's been given up. God's moved on. Now we're here, and we're the ones that God's using. Romans chapter 11 is a very powerful statement that Paul makes against this mentality. He says, and if some of the branches, meaning the branches of Israel, the Jews or the Israelites, on the main branch that God created, the land of Israel, the people of Israel, from Abraham. If those branches were broken off and you, being a wild olive tree, were grafted in among them, and with them became a partaker of the root and fatness of the olive tree, do not boast against the branches. But if you do boast, remember that you do not support the root, but the root supports you. You will say then, branches were broken off that I may be grafted in. This is like an arrogance. This is a pride. And I feel this in the Torah community. A pride, like we're better than what they are. We're doing it right and they're wrong. Judaism is evil and needs to be done away with. And that's not what I believe, and it's not what Solel believes. And it will not be taught from here. The Jewish people have done wrong, yes. But there's a lot that they have done right. If nothing else, as Paul says, they have kept the oracles of God alive to this day, that we may have the scriptures. Do I hear a hallelujah to that? Verse 19, you will say, 20, well said, because of unbelief they were broken off and you stand by faith. Do not be haughty, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, he may not spare you either. Therefore, consider the goodness and severity of God. On those who fell, severity, but toward you goodness, if you continue in his goodness. Otherwise, you also be cut off, and they also. If they do not continue in unbelief, will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. So the Jews that are unbelieving, that are in the land of Israel, that God has miraculously made to come back to that land and restore the Hebrew language and do all these amazing things, if they place their faith in Yeshua, they will be back grafted in, just as we at one time were. For if we were cut off out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and were grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these who are natural branches be grafted in to their own olive tree? And so we see here this land and this legacy were given to Abram all the way back in Genesis 13. And God says it's a forever thing. The land is still viable today. The prophecies of the Old Testament, the Tanakh, by the prophets, are not been fulfilled yet. And I do not think because Israel denied Yeshua that all of a sudden all those prophecies are no more. Because that's what a lot of people will say today. Yes, Israel killed their Messiah, as it was prophesied they would do. God chose to have that happen. But many of those same Jews that were there proclaimed faith in Yeshua and turned from that evil and proclaimed the truth of their Messiah, and have been doing that since that time. And so the land and the legacy are still active today. Going back to Abraham, what is the next step that Yehovah requires of Abraham in this encounter? So he's made these unconditional promises to him. What is next? The next thing that he says there, he says to Abram, arise and walk in the land. Abraham, move forward. Do not stop here, but walk over the land I am giving you. Grab hold of this promise by being an active participant in the blessing I am bestowing upon you. It is always interesting to me that Abram, in his lifetime, never gets to see the fulfillment of the promise. In fact, the only part of the land that he actually receives in his entire lifetime is a grave that he buys for him and his family. Think about that. The only place of property that he has in his life is where he's going to be buried when he dies. That would be pretty sad, wouldn't it? If you got a promise from your parents, son, we're going to give you all this land, And in your whole entire lifetime, all you get is the plot of land where you're going to die in and be buried in. And a gravestone's going to be smacked there. That would be pretty depressing, wouldn't it? I'm sure that would be the mindset if we were Abram. If I was Abram, that would probably be my mindset. But that's the difference of what God has been teaching Abram in his life. At this point in time, Abram's vision, his understanding of who God is and the plan that he has for him has been changed. And the faith is greater now than it even was when he called him out of Ur of Chaldees. He walks by faith throughout the land, knowing that his heavenly Father one day would give it to his family. Yehovah was true to his promise, and he continues to give the land to the seed of Abram today. Many believers want Yehovah to show them the whole map before they take a step. Abraham was told, walk first, understand later. Genesis 13 gives us a pattern for the life of faith. When we look at this section here, we see in Abram that first thing he did is he returned to the altar. When we drift from God's plan for our lives, when we oftentimes go astray, the goal is to go back to where we met him the first time. Go back to the beginning, to that beginning of the relationship with God. Remember the joy of your love at first. Choose faith over sight. Do not grasp what looks good, but trust that what Yehovah has spoken will happen. Obey Yehovah's voice. Clarity comes after surrender. Abraham is not great because he never failed, but because he always returned. He realized his mistakes and grew in faith and action from those mistakes. If we look at our world today, a world that looks like Egypt and Sodom and Gomorrah and all the other evil places that are mentioned in the scriptures, many of those are full of voices telling you to grasp, to take, to secure, to protect. But the man of Yehovah does something different. He returns to God. He yields sight to faith, and he trusts in the God of the universe. And he calls on the name of Yehovah. Isaiah chapter 62 and verse 10 says, going back to the term Solel and Pathfinders, go through the gates, prepare the way for the people, build up the highway, take out the stones, lift up a banner for the peoples. That's what our job today is in the line of Abraham. We are to be the ones, the pathfinders, the ones like Abraham, willing to go throughout the land and claim the land. We're going throughout the land, and we're redeeming the land and the people back to God. We're clearing the way so that they can see their God, their Messiah, and his commands in their lives. Shabbat shalom.